Coming out of World War II, the second communist Red Scare overtook America, as across the nation, people feared that the government would turn communist, causing many people to conform due to fear that being unique would label them as red when the U.S. adopted the policy McCarthyism. The economic revitalization of the 1950s led to the emergence of mass production and mass consumption. In order to buy the goods, which were said to be able to meet the needs of individuals, people had to work harder and were engaged in work without actual meaning. Thus, the meaning of life changed. While people were met with growing material needs, they were also unwittingly giving up their own freedom of choice and their independent will. Thus, the development of the American consumer society and the political constraints of McCarthyism made the 1950s a depressing era. Thus, the silent generation became the most vivid and revealing title of young people during this period. They were subject to every social depression and bondage, lost the passion and ideals of young people, and became the abnormal children created by the affluent society of the 1950s. A group of American post-World War II writers came to prominence when they rebelled against the ideals of the silent generation and went against conformity to live the life they wanted. They were the Beat Generation, as they wrote about living spontaneously on the road and encouraged others to do so. Many other men followed, but the Beats also drew a great deal of opposition from American conservatives. While men were allowed to rebel, women's lives could only acceptably be conformed. They were expected to remain perfect American housewives. As Betty Friedan wrote in Feminine Mystique, the problem that has no name bursts like a boil through the image of the happy American housewife. If women retaliated and tried to live their own lives, they were rejected by society.
Even though the Beat movement was cultivated for and by men, the women who joined the Beat literary circle, Diane di Prima, Joyce Johnson, and Lenore Kandel, broke an even greater barrier by opening the general idea of a modern American woman up for discussion, as they acted in unladylike manners, overall living and writing on the edge. Facing greater opposition from society, they broke barriers through writing while raising families and holding unique social lives. Overall, they transgressed the cultural norm for femininity, leading for and supporting a further discussion of women's rights and individuality in the 1960s women's liberation movement. These women refused to conform to what women were to do and lived their lives as wild, energetic young adults in a time where that wasn't acceptable for women.
They were supposed to be the little housewife and the perfect little house dress, and so they had to break the chains of the domesticity.
As Diane di Prima wrote, "It is more like straight ahead. This is how I want to live my life. Get out of my way." These women felt that they were just as capable at cultivating change in society as the Beat men, and no barrier was going to stop them from joining in.
There was no reason I couldn't do what these folks had done. There was no reason I couldn't at least try. At that moment, I made what I knew then would be a lifelong commitment. From then on, for many years, I didn't let a day go by without writing.
These women came to the San Francisco Renaissance, where they found their voices to cultivate the Beat movement and play their parts by expressing themselves in their writing and poetry. They hoped to make a great change and reform in society, and these ambitions took them far from the misogynistic barriers that once blocked them.
The chance to actually act on what I believed in, to take a shot at creating the world as we dreamed it. It made me eager to join these amazing folks, poets, diggers, panthers, zennies, outriders, and rebels of all sorts, in the hope-filled and wild experiment that was bubbling away in this city.
To get some freedom of their own, they used writing poetry as an outlet to express as well as share their feelings and emotions.
We were not so much concerned with reforming our relationships with men as with our fight to have, to have sex lives, to have independence. Those were the things that concerned us.
Facing much adversity along the way, these women continued to write and live the lives they wanted for themselves. Very few people encouraged these women in their art. Male Beats did not even respect them as artists, leaving them with little assistance in writing and publishing their work. Joyce Johnson recalls, "The rare man that encouraged me in my writing was Jack Kerouac." The families of these women did not even support them in their endeavors. Beat writer Gregory Corso said, "Their families put them in institutions. They were given electric shock. In the 50s, if you were male, you could be a rebel. But if you were female, your families had you locked up." DePrima, Johnson, and Candell were the few female writers that were resilient enough to pass through these struggles and support themselves on their own, enabling them to break these misogynistic barriers. Historian Brenda Knight wrote, "Ironically, because the women in the movement have, to a certain degree, been ignored and marginalized, they represent the precious little of that which remains truly beat." Being the few women that managed to fight through these struggles, DePrima, Johnson, and Candell became the most recognized for their activism and literary works. Throughout the 1960s, they worked as members of the San Francisco Diggers. The Diggers was a proto-hippie political movement where they fed the poor, fought against the wars, and did underground publishing. The Diggers' biggest stride during this time was Lenore Candell's Love Book, which put them on trial for obscenity. The government impounded Candell's book on the grounds that it excited lewd thoughts. Candell fought this finding despite much opposition, having the longest trial in San Francisco history, as the jury took 5 weeks to make a decision after hearing Candell's fight.
And when she was challenged in court, she defended the Love Book as a 23-year search for an appropriate way to worship, that sexual acts between loving persons are religious. She was basically using sort of the American Constitution against itself, and that this, her Love Book was her expression of her faith.
Federal court finally overturned the prosecution in 1974 and sales of the book skyrocketed. The Woman Beats finally gained attention as artists in the literary community.
Lenore Candell's obscenity trial brought the women's beat movement to light and led many women to join the Beats. Many began to rebel after seeing how the people of the beat movement were fighting for their independence.
We were sort of a transitional bridge between the past and the future, which would come very quickly.
From the Beat generation merged the hippie movement, which incorporated many of the same ideals as the Beats. The hippies were a younger generation that had some of the same ideas as the Beats, but expressed their thoughts through more actions and music rather than words. Women of the hippie movement, along with many other now working women, fought for women's liberation during the civil rights movement, bringing the Beat women's feminist ideals to life. Feminist leader Betty Friedan led others to march around Washington advocating women's liberation. As a result of the women's liberation movement, women gained more of the unwritten rights of society, and their accepted independence was accepted in American culture. Before this, women were expected to do nothing, but now they were seen as functional and more involved members of society.
All we wanted to do was change the world, and we did change quite a lot, actually. Certainly left some effects. I mean, they're all seeds. That's all you can really leave, is seeds. And then they'll sprout and turn into something you would have never imagined. And better than you would imagine, I hope.
The sense to fight as a strong and confident woman has journeyed into today's world. Today, the Women's March demands respect and civil rights. Working women join to chant and protest for what they feel is rightfully theirs, recognition, which is not far at all from what the Beat women are searching for. Today's feminism is an extension of what the Beats fought for. Therefore, the Beat women were successful in their endeavors of empowering other fellow women. Now women have an input, and they will continue to flaunt their ideas for all to see. As historian Brenda Knight said, DePrima, Johnson, and Candell were feminists before the word was coined, and their work stands beside that of the men. Their commitment to women's rights, to prisoners' rights, to abortion reform, to challenging any form of individual or state violence, and fighting for freedoms of speech, a battle never completely won, has never tired. Since the 1950s, they have influenced and educated women, reminding them of their inner personalities and strength through fighting the misogynistic barriers that once existed in society.